Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Windows on the World. I've had a few technical problems here tonight. I'm going to try and go out live. We're a few minutes late and just actually trying to get the show to go out because we've had a few problems with the internet stream. I'm going to try and stay on here and do the show, but if it goes off I will re-upload it very soon. But last week's show covered just about everything about the very corporate-backed Extinction Rebellion and its agents of change. All the information in that show is at windowsontheworld.net. Our next talk, The Bigger Picture, which we take around the country, is in Oxford on the 12th of May. Go to Windows on the World homepage and click on the Eventbrite link. It's only £10 for the whole day, and that's 3 speakers, myself, Sandy Adams, and of course Piers Corbyn. It starts at 12 midday, and the venue will be announced before the event. So I think we are live. I'll carry on. But also available soon will be a series of audio downloads about the way the present system works and who we are in the system and what you can do about it. Well, that's in relation to protecting what rights you may have left, and also solutions to common problems such as debt and even dealing with irritating officials. I think everybody will appreciate that. But tonight, I'm going to wrap up a lot of issues we've been talking about on the Extinction Rebellion protests and the pushing of the global warming narrative, which was out of the boundaries of credibility long ago, but because, and with the help of these sort of climate activists, it's losing even more credibility by the day, and that's just through their actions. But the Extinction Rebellion have surpassed their own stupidity recently. With a die-in at Waitrose. I kid you not. Yes, lots of well-off kids who shop at Waitrose decided to lie on the floor because they have nothing to do and have completely misinterpreted the UN IPCC document, the Special Report 15, which is actually the foundation document of their whole movement. None of them seem to know anything about it. And also, what's interesting, as we reported last week, was they seem to have reinterpreted it in their own special way. In other words, the person who actually wrote the report, the author of the IPCC SR15 report, said that Extinction Rebellion had completely misrepresented it. Now, the group have been stationed at Marble Arch, and the old controlled opposition faces from the well-infiltrated Occupy protests at St Paul's in London have been showing up as part of the controlled opposition comedy and street theatre group Extinction Rebellion. So it's amazing how people don't cotton on. Well, a few have, and there have been 1 or 2 undercover operatives who were singled out and publicly named. Yes, the old infiltrators of Occupy have regrouped under the ER banner to control the narrative and single out those who may have a brain cell left. Yes, we're still live. That's really good news. I was actually broadcasting on a different device, and I'm now actually using a phone, and it seems to be better, so we'll carry on. But it's amazing how people don't cotton on. Well, a few have, and there have been like 1 or 2 of these undercover operatives, as I said, sort of singled out. They've been publicly named as well. So yes, the old infiltrators of Occupy have regrouped under the ER banner to control the narrative and single out those who may have, yes, a brain cell or 2 left. Now, let's get on to the next section. Extinction Rebellion has links with the London Parliament Square, it was so-called Democracy Village. Now, the MI5 operation, which was Democracy Village, had undercover police and paid activists who stopped the anti-war protesters or their supporters staying on the square opposite Parliament. This is where Brian Hoare, of course, was actually camping for several years with his protest. And the restricting of the area and the removal of Brian Hoare and Barbara Tucker, of course, was done with the help of George Barder, who's now a big part of Extinction Rebellion. This is from The Independent on February 2012, actually. Occupy protesters insisted they would return to the city this is the City of London, St Paul's, despite the loss of the camp, as George Barder, who had camped outside St Paul's for the past 4.5 months, said, "We will very much be back to this space where people have been assembling for 800 years. Well, he and his activists made sure it would never happen again. It was Barder, with other paid activists, who took over Occupy and installed state operatives and facilitators, including the literally larger-than-life I Am the Walrus, Saskia Kent, who managed to reduce the Occupy protest from hundreds down to just a matter of a few in weeks. In fact, at the last General Assembly, there were 12 fake activists and a dog, plus the dragons. Now, these are the people who shout at you if you ask a question. These are the same dragons who threaten members of the public by email. You know, those members of the public, the ones who ask questions about Extinction Rebellion. Well, see last week's show and the sinister emails sent by the sinister and childish dragons of Extinction Rebellion. They're all linked to the show and that article at windowsontheworld.net. It's called Extinction Rebellion, The Facts. Now, if you want to see Occupy, Extinction Rebellion, Climate Camp, whatever template you wish to apply to protest by numbers, rebellion robots roll out, whatever you want to call it, protesting by numbers, the rebellion robots. Check out Saskia Kent and her ridiculous repetitive sound bites in our films, The Puppet Masters of Occupy and The Puppet Masters of Occupy Revisited. Now, they're things like, "We want a sustainable future. Humanity towards irreversible climate change. What do we want? Soros. When do we want it? Group consensus. Whose sweets? Our sweets." Yeah, you couldn't make it up, but they do. I mean, she even had them repeating after her. Get this. This is this Saskia Kent, who's now joined Occupy. She said, "This is what democracy looks like." And they all repeat it and go, "This is what democracy looks like." It's quite incredible. So Saskia Kent actually works for the University of East Anglia, a place not new to the lies of global warming. And of course, ClimateGate. Remember the ClimateGate emails out of the University of East Anglia? So, it does appear that these old faces have been spotted down at Marble Arch HQ. Yes, the new home of Extinction Rebellion. What a reunion they must be having, and all still on the payroll of low-level intelligence gathering, dividing and ruling those who get in the way, and getting the remainder of the worker drones to repeat short phrases at regular intervals. So, let's get on to this. A director of Compassionate Revolution, George Barder, well, Compassionate Revolution is the company behind Extinction Rebellion, Compassionate Revolution Limited. So George Barder and his co-workers also made sure that protests would never be allowed back onto Parliament Square. This is very interesting. And he's now a director of Compassionate Revolution, along with Roger Hallam and Gail Bradbrook. Of course, Gail Bradbrook is the lady who prefers emotion and belief over facts, as can be seen from the Extinction Rebellion campaign. But basically, it's the company behind Extinction Rebellion, the most obviously fake protest so far. I have to say this because I'm actually getting quite bored with it now, because I think we've said about everything we can about Extinction Rebellion. I don't think there's any more information we could put out apart from look at their latest publicity stunts. And basically building on the success of taking down real Occupy protest and replacing it with these Soros-backed climate change agendas, and now to its logical conclusion is basically Extinction Rebellion. That is the end. It cannot go lower than this. So it's basically a state-backed cartoon of a venture which has seen the most ineffective people used as a flash mob for global governance and climate change taxation scams for the UN. I mean, they even spout the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is actually what they do at their meetings. It's all a carbon copy cutout of what the UN are advocating. Now, those that are going to restrict your life and tax you to death and take away any rights you may think you had. That's what this is all about. Basically, these people are campaigning for their own enslavement. Now, this of course has the backing of the Green Party, who support the fake green agenda literally and emphatically, along of course with Friends of the Earth, who have a history of losing cases and basically getting their own lawyers to get rid of real activists and get them kicked off protest sites. We reported on that last week. It was the same person who got sinister emails from the Extinction Rebellion Dragons, actually. He was the one who told us about that because he's an ex-member of Friends of the Earth. He was actually a campaigner for Friends of the Earth. So, yes, there's nothing green about any of this. Well, the people who follow it are green, but we're going to get to the people who see through it as well, and there's quite a lot of those. Now, one thing these activists won't touch is 5G, a technology that has not been tested on the public and has caused serious concerns from experts in the field. It has been announced that, get this, the Glastonbury Festival will be a trial centre for this untested millimetre wave technology, even though the infrastructure will probably only handle 4G, and they'll be using it as a test bed. All of those people at Glastonbury, all of those festival goers will be guinea pigs in this new and untested weapons grade rollout, the millimetre wave technology, which is also used in this crowd control system called the active denial system. Basically, it burns your skin so much you have to run away. Look at that one, and then get back to me and tell me if you still want to go to Glastonbury. But a good reason to boycott this now very corporate festival. Just save your money for the smaller ones. They're much more fun and they need to be supported. They're the festivals where you don't get frisked before you go in, you don't get your van searched, and you don't have bouncers at the door. You know, those smaller festivals where people gather and sit in fields and there's a couple of bands on. Those sort of festivals, you know, like they used to have. Well, let's get on to this next. Talking of the Green Party, one of our speakers, Sandy, contacted a Green Party member and councillor about the introduction of 5G and supplying the information proving that ER is a corporate-backed venture and nothing to do with saving the planet. And this is the response she got from the Green Party member and councillor. Now, this Green Party member and councillor had been sent all the information that we put out last week, plus more. And I think she's called Denise Mitchell or Denise Michelle. This is in response to the Extinction Rebellion Exposed post, which was sent to her. She says, "I've seen it and I think it sucks. I will not be sharing. These ex-rebellion guys are doing a great job bringing people's attention to the real problems the whole world faces. I mean, I really don't care how the message gets out, just as long as it does. It is far too late to have scruples about the messenger." Can you believe this? Can you actually believe it? Now, having no scruples seems to be a qualifying factor in the fake green movement. She carries on, "No, I really don't care. 5G we will deal with in time. It is already looking doubtful it will get off the ground with the Chinese stuff that is going on, the phone company. But right now, I think spreading this stuff is counterproductive to the climate emergency." Well, I wonder if she has ever had to substantiate that statement. Can anyone actually send me proof of this emergency? Or is it a lot of forthcoming kind of, in the future sometime apocalypse like all the others, you know? I mean, how many more do we need? She carries on, it will just stop the whole movement of caring individuals who really want to do something. Well, the interesting thing is that she falls into the trap of, well, at least they are doing something. Well, you know, I could sit in the road, I could glue myself to a train, I could lie down in Waitrose, but at least I'd be doing something, you know. But she carries on. As to have I listened to it? Yes, I have. And I'm so disappointed this is being spread at this time when we really do need to shout about climate issues. He's put in capital letters. Has it not occurred to you that this video is out there to stop the protests? Perhaps helpful to investigate that. Well, there's nothing that can be said when someone has no argument or competence. So little said about that, the better. But the point is that she doesn't seem to realise that fake protests actually ruin protest. The whole idea of this is that it's delegitimising protests in the eyes of the public. That's the bit she doesn't get. It's making the public turn on protesters, which is probably one of the suggested outcomes that this is going to have. And when she says that is, we just have to do something. This just seems to be the way that people think now. They seem to think that if they do something, in other words, if they are seen to be doing something, if they're seen to be virtue signalling to doing something, that's all it takes. It's completely shallow. So this is the state of the so-called Greens. They are the most easily manipulated of the lot. If any of our listeners have any evidence of a climate emergency, though, please send it in, as I've been waiting for one for years. Now, an interesting event happened today, that's Sunday, at Friends of the Earth headquarters in London. Two activists who have been the victims of controlled opposition went into a Reclaim the Power meeting at Friends of the Earth offices in London, where Reclaim the Power was stationed. And they called them out on the tactics which appear to have got people arrested and into trouble. Now, last week we reported on the groups such as Reclaim the Power, Earth First, Gail Bradbrook's organisation Rising Up, which operates through the limited company Compassionate Revolution Limited, and Rising Up comes out of these groups, these police-infiltrated groups such as Reclaim the Power, Climate Camp and Democracy Village. That was said in last week's show, and those are the organisations, the infiltrated organisations, which Rising Up came out of. Isn't that interesting? So we've already mentioned that George Barder was part of Democracy Village, who got Brian Hoare and Barbara Tucker kicked off, who were actually doing a legitimate protest against the Iraq war very peacefully and getting a lot of public attention there. Well, we shared all this earlier, but the group was successfully removed by the anti-war protesters, Brian Hoare and Barbara Tucker. Yeah, they got them off Parliament Square. And furthermore, they banned all permanent protest and gatherings there. Now, the agents of Democracy Village used every dirty trick imaginable against Brian Hoare and Barbara Tucker. They'd camped outside Parliament for several years. George Barder, an agent of Democracy Village, is a director of the holding company for Extinction Rebellion, Stinky Rebellion, which is Compassionate Revolution Limited, along with Gail Bradbrook and Roger Hallam. Now, that is where all the public donations are going. Now, let's get on to this Reclaim the Power, because this seems to be an organisation that a lot of real activists have had an issue with. It's one of the groups connected to Compassionate Revolution Limited, Extinction Rebellion in other words. It says it aims to be a horizontal organisation. This is on their website. Now, what this means in simple terms is that we don't have any leaders or managers. This is what they say. In simple terms, we don't have any leaders or managers. Well, pull the other one. I mean, all these groups are run in a compartmentalised fashion with a mass of useful and well-meaning foot soldiers and a manipulative group of facilitators and trainers with a sinister hierarchy operating out of the view of the activists, which is actually where the real power is. And then they have the nerve to say, it is open to everyone to join in and contribute. Responsibility for decisions and making them happen is completely shared by participants. No, it isn't. It's done by group consensus led by facilitators using Delphi technique. Now, it carries on. Reclaim the Power uses consensus decision-making in all its gatherings, working group meetings and events. Consensus decision-making seeks to find solutions that everyone is happy with, or at least can live with. It is an alternative to major voting that privileges the view of the majority. Well, it makes it look as though everyone has agreed, basically. Anyone who hasn't is marginalised and gotten rid of. This is how they do it, through these consensus meetings and Delphi technique. Again, take a look at our film from years ago, when we discovered how all this worked. It's called The Puppet Masters of Occupy, and also the one about the fake squat, which was set up to promote climate change through the George Soros agenda of creating these groups. It's called Inside Occupy and the Bank of Ideas. We've reported widely on that, but take a look at it and you'll see actually one or two of the old faces, which are now the new faces of Extinction Rebellion. Yes, the old faces being the undercover operatives which took over the Occupy at St. Paul's and turned it all into a climate change agenda, and then got rid of anybody who was a real activist and put the activists in their place. Now, Reclaim the Power compare their decision-making process with that of Climate Camp Action and Occupy, where trained facilitators and known agent provocateurs and undercover operatives controlled the group's general assemblies. Now, template organisations using template manifestos, which are there only as gatekeepers to monitor activists, that's all they're there for. They control the group and feed information to the police and the intelligence services. Yes, it's true. We found this all out years ago. But this is Reclaim the Power. Their PR carries on. Political and social activists have made use of consensus decision-making in recent years. Yes, they have. The Camp for Climate Action, which was basically a police undercover operation, Climate Camp Action, it went across the globe. It says, and Occupy are just two examples. So Climate Camp Action and Occupy are just two of the examples that Reclaim the Power give of their system, you know, their democratic system where everyone has a say by consensus, which means everyone agrees or they're made to agree, or if they don't agree, then they're marginalised and kicked out. So basically, this, with the information that we put out on last week's show, Extinction Rebellion, the Facts, says all there is to be said about these cardboard cutouts. When one of the Reclaim the Power members was told about the grievances of the activists at the Friends of the Earth office, one of them stated, this is really funny, this happened today, I will not speak to you as you do not agree that your view of reality is different from mine. Now, this is incredible, isn't it? This is the post-truth world. So in other words, there's any reality that you want, you choose your own reality. Your reality is different from mine. And I hear this a lot from these people. They seem to think that there's many different realities. Maybe there are many different realities. Maybe they're taking too many drugs. Or maybe they're confusing how they feel about things with reality and facts. But another Reclaim the Power person, this was really funny, started crying spontaneously, then very quickly started laughing in her next response when she was questioned about her sort of mood changes. This is what she said. Are you saying my emotional reactions aren't genuine? Well, yes. As someone who was genuine would get very angry about being accused of faking their emotions, wouldn't they? In fact, it would, in anyone who was genuine, it would lead to a spontaneous outburst. But nothing spontaneous ever comes out of activists. It's about them first and virtue signalling second, followed by, here I am, lying on the floor in Waitrose, doing something. We have to do something. But this is the typical post-truth world type response. And the reason that these childish and monotonous template organisations exist, it's because truth is not paramount. There's only emotions and beliefs that are important. And this is actually the whole way these groups have been psychologically constructed. This is how they're controlled, through belief and emotion. I mean, this is the typical post-truth world type response, isn't it? I mean, we covered this last week, that Gail Bradbrook of Extinction Rebellion states that people respond to emotions and beliefs over facts. Nowhere is this more apparent than these state-controlled protest groups and their robotic responses to evidence, which always avoids facts and relies on these emotional responses. Now let's move on swiftly to the BBC documentary Climate Change, the Facts. Well, that's kind of contradictory if anyone's seen it. Apparently, it managed not to contain any. And the Global Warming Policy Foundation has made a formal complaint to the BBC about the series of gross inaccuracies in its recent documentary. Yes, the one we're talking about, Climate Change, the Facts. Now, the programme highlighted suggestions that storms, floods, heat waves and sea level rise are all rapidly getting worse as a result of climate change. However, the best available data published in the last few years by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and NASA contradicts the BBC's alarmist exaggeration of empirical evidence. Now, the IPCC are known for their projections based on computer models which never come true. So for the Global Warming Policy Foundation to support their view must mean that the BBC are not only exaggerating but outright lying, which is basically what they conclude. Now, let's get on to the IPCC paper. This is the fifth assessment report, which came out in 2013, and it concluded, current data sets indicate no significant observed trends in global tropical cyclone frequency over the past century. No robust trends in annual numbers of tropical storms, hurricanes and major hurricanes counts have been identified over the past 100 years in the North Atlantic basin. In its more recent special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees C, published in 2018, which is the one that the Extinction Rebellion people are founding their movement on, it stated that numerous studies towards and beyond AR5, that's this AR5 document, have reported a decreasing trend in the global number of tropical cyclones and or the globally accumulated cyclonic energy. There is consequently low confidence in the large number of studies reporting increasing trends in the global number of very intense cyclones. Regarding floods, the IPCC's special report concluded there is low confidence due to limited evidence, however, that anthropogenic climate changes have affected the frequency and the magnitude of floods. Now, this is in direct opposition to what they're saying. This is what all these climate alarmists are saying, that there's going to be an absolute catastrophe and we're in an extinction event. Well, they don't actually clarify what they mean by that, because they confuse pollution with climate and weather, and they're different things. However, even the IPCC, who lobby on behalf of the UN and have a raft of climate gravy train alarmists and storytellers on their panel, are now calling out the BBC and Attenborough. So that's a really good thing. There is also no observational evidence, it says here, that the rate of sea level rise is getting worse. Now, we've covered this with Niels Axelmorner, who is the world's leading expert in, guess what, sea levels. And we've covered this in many shows. Go into the back catalogue, look up Neil Axelmorner, and you will find the ex-IPCC sea level expert Niels Axelmorner telling you that no, the sea levels aren't going to rise by feet or meters. It's absolute rubbish. And the people behind this at the top know it's rubbish. But this is about control of population, taxation. That's what it's all about. And the Extinction Rebels are actually working towards their own enslavement, which we have actually suggested in previous shows. But getting back to the sea level rise, there has been an annual mean sea level rise, it says here, of 3.3 millimetres. Now, that's disputed in some places, with no significant level of acceleration in the last 3 decades. So what they do is they get these islands that are sinking and they say, oh, look, this is sea level rise. No, it's not. The islands are sinking because they're built on coral and people are building on them. There's all sorts of different things that aren't taken into consideration here, and all sorts of exaggerations and manipulations of the data. But it says suggestions by David Attenborough and Michael Mann that climate change is causing increases in wildfires in the US and globally are also misleading and not supported by any empirical evidence. Michael Mann produced the famous hockey stick graph, do you remember that? Which exaggerated global temperatures. Now, as far as wildfires go, because this is another thing that they brought up in this fear porn documentary narrated by David Attenborough, the TV presenter who knows nothing about climate change, it says, according to a survey published by the Royal Society, the global area burned has actually declined over past decades, and there is increasing evidence to suggest that there is less fire in the global landscape today than centuries ago. These are vitally important facts that should have been mentioned if an accurate description of the impact of climate change on wildfires was to be maintained. Now, this is the second fake news scandal to embroil Sir David Attenborough in the space of a fortnight. Earlier this month, another Attenborough documentary, Our Planet, which went out on Netflix, was accused of misrepresenting footage of walruses tumbling to their deaths over a cliff. Oh, are we talking about Saskia Kent again? No, sorry. These are the real walruses. So walruses are the new lemmings, are they? Remember that Lemmings documentary in the 50s by Disney? I don't know if you've ever seen it, but the creatures were so boring, these lemmings, they filmed them. And they couldn't get them to do anything, so it was decided that they would chase them all over a cliff to liven up the subject, and it got a better ending. So, then the lemmings decide to commit mass suicide. Well, no, they don't. The crew just chased them over a cliff to make the end of the documentary a little bit more interesting, which actually give the documentary an ending. Now, it says here, Attenborough claimed on the voiceover that this had been caused by climate change, which is basically, this thing about the walruses. And the melting sea ice on which the walruses hunted for food, basically this was all caused by climate change, what happened to them. So this is really interesting because it goes to show that even the people who are putting out basically the establishment take on all this are ripping it apart as well. So the BBC seems to have failed on every front here. It says that evidence has since emerged that it wasn't climate change which killed the walruses, but rather a combination of marauding polar bears and the Netflix film crew, whose activities may have scared the tusk-bewhiskered creatures to their doom, it says here. Attenborough, the naturalist, causing a mass extinction. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? So all of these walruses disappearing and freaking out is because of David Attenborough. Well, this is what happens when you get presenters or actors like Attenborough actually being given credibility. Now, we reported last week how he was taken seriously by the IMF, or more likely, being used as their glove puppet to further the global taxation and control grid being implemented on the back of the big lie. Okay, so it's the same scenario as Al Gore with his inconvenient fact-free movie. Remember that? Where the judge stopped at 15 major errors and said if it was shown in schools, then it should have an addendum and all this stuff should be put in. But we have to remember, in Al Gore's case, it's a business plan. But does Attenborough believe this or not? If he does, then he is working at the right fake news organisation, but it seriously undermines anything else he has ever said. So all of those wildlife documentaries, I know a lot of them are very contrived, but he's obviously not a man to ever be taken seriously. Maybe they've got something on him. Maybe he's compromised in some way. Maybe something will come out in the future. Who knows, and who really cares? Well, let's get on to something rather amusing. One Oxford professor has been breaking down the bounds of credibility on the climate change issue even more. Now, this story comes from Oxford Looniversity. An Oxford University professor has claimed aliens are already breeding with humans to create a new hybrid species that will save the planet. Dr. Young Hai Chi, an instructor in Korean at Oxford's Oriental Institute, part of the prestigious university, it says here, thinks this new species will save Earth from annihilation and from, guess what? Yeah, you got it, climate change. I mean, he is seriously undermining the intelligence of off-planetary visitors, and an abduction experience might help to sort him out here. That might actually help him. Maybe the aliens can take him to one side and tell him a few of the facts. Basically, that the weather's driven primarily by the sun, the temperature is driven by the sun, and the carbon dioxide story might be a bit of a myth. Well, he believes there is a strong correlation between climate change and alien abduction. This was in the Oxford Student newspaper, right? Well, he probably has more evidence to support his theory than Al Gore or David Attenborough. Maybe he should join Extinction Rebellion. Well, they need more convincing proof for their arguments, and this may be it. It could really catch on, couldn't it? His book, which it says here is written in Korean, is called Alien Visitations and the End of Humanity. He says he has identified 4 types of aliens: small, Tall and bold, scaly with snake eyes, and insect-like. Wait a minute, that sounds like the founder members of the Independent Group, doesn't it? Well, Dr. Chi believes the insect aliens may be in charge, and they may be giving orders to their other types of aliens. Now, the aliens exist, he says, in their own biosystem that humans cannot experience because our perception is limited by our organs. This is what the professor has claimed. Well, this explains the Green Party then, I suppose. So, as the aliens are said to be highly intelligent, so Dr. Chi believes they could solve the problems on the Earth in the future, such as climate change. Well, what about the aliens who want geoengineering? I mean, this must be an off-planetary thing, this geoengineering, mustn't it? I mean, what are they trying to do, the aliens? Maybe you should ask them why they're doing this geoengineering. Is it to make the planet habitable for their species? You know, their species, the ones that are part of the alien race, like David Keith, the geoengineer, and Bill Gates, the billionaire philanthropist. Well, if these aliens were highly intelligent, why would they believe the climate change story? I mean, this needs a convincing and unexpected plot twist. And in fact, that was it, the sci-fi series. This is what it could be all about. Because in the series of V, do you remember that? The aliens landed, they put these spaceships all over the world, and they all met up with the UN and they formed a world government, and they took over the world. So maybe that's what he means. Maybe he is working for them. He said, so they come not for the sake of us, but for the sake of them, their survival. But their survival is actually our survival as well. The survival of the entire biosphere. Dr. Chi said he was still looking for more evidence to support the view. So, good luck with that. Well, together with David Attenborough and Al Gore, they will give you all the proof you need. They both make it up as they go along. In Attenborough's case, just give him a script and a few bottles of sincerity pills, and he will say anything you want. Now, in this last section of the show, I want to remind the listener about a newspaper article that came out on the 7th of February 2015. Now, the thing is with climate change stories, there's a new one every day in The Guardian. None of the ones in The Guardian have any facts. You get the odd one coming through, and there was one about satellite data recently, which was very convincing, which basically said that, yes, guess what? The alarmists had got it wrong. But this was from Christopher Booker. And he says here, when future generations look back on the global warming scare of the past 30 years, nothing will shock them more than the extent to which the official temperature records, on which the entire panic ultimately rested, were systematically adjusted to show the Earth as having warmed much more than the actual data justified. 2 weeks ago, under the headline, How We Are Being Tricked by Flawed Data on Global Warming, he says, I wrote about Paul Homewood, who on his Not a Lot of People Know That blog, had checked the published temperature graphs for 3 weather stations in Paraguay against the temperatures that had originally been recorded. In each instance, the actual trend of 60 years of data had been dramatically reversed, so that a cooling trend was changed to one that showed a marked warming. Now, there's many examples of this since. Look at our previous shows and just put it into an internet search and look at all those papers, the ones from scientists and credible sources, including sources from within the IPCC, which contradict the whole of the alarmist story. Well, this was one of the last of many examples of a practice, it says here, long recognised by expert observers around the world, one that raises an even larger question mark over the entire official surface temperature record. He says, following my last article, this is Christopher Booker, Homewood checked a swathe of other South American weather stations around the original 3. In each case, he found the same suspicious one-way adjustments. First, these were made by the US government's Global Historical Climate Network. They were then amplified by 2 of the main official surface records, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, GISS, they use that a lot, and the National Climate Data Center, which used the warming trends to estimate temperatures across these vast regions of the Earth where no measurements are taken. Yet these are the very records on which scientists and politicians rely for their belief in global warming. So isn't it interesting to recap on what was said just a few years ago, how things change and how the desperation of the UN and IPCC to bring in this carbon tax agenda has accelerated. It's gone down to the scaremongering, if it goes above 1.5 degrees, we're all going to die. It's absolutely incredible the way that it's been ramped up. Now, one of the first examples, it says here, of these adjustments was exposed in 2007 by the statistician Steve McIntyre when he discovered a paper published in 1987 by James Hansen. Now, he's the scientist who later turned into a fanatical climate activist, who for many years ran GISS, G-I-S-S, what we've just been talking about, for the data. Now, Hansen's original graph showed temperatures in the Arctic as having been much higher around 1940 than at any time since. But as Homewood reveals in his blog post, temperature adjustments transform Arctic history. This is what it's called. Temperature adjustments transform Arctic history. GISS has turned this upside down. Arctic temperatures from that time have been lowered so much that they are now dwarfed by those of the past 20 years. Homewood's interest in the Arctic is partly because the vanishing of its polar ice, and the polar bears, of course, has become such a poster child for those trying to persuade us that we're threatened by runaway warming. But he chose that particular stretch of the Arctic because it was where ice is affected by warmer water brought in by the cyclical shifts in major Atlantic current. This last peaked at just the time 75 years ago when Arctic ice retreated even further than it has done recently. Now this is so important. This is only a few years ago this came out. It says the ice melt is not caused by rising global temperatures at all. So go and tell this to the people who are enforcing global tyranny through the idea of anthropological global warming. It carries on. Of much more serious significance, however, is the way this wholesale manipulation of the official temperature record, for reasons GHCN and GISS have never plausibly explained, has become the real elephant in the room of the greatest and most costly scare the world has known. This really does begin to look like one of the greatest scientific scandals of all. Now, that was then. And recently, when the UN IPCC SR15 document was released, there was a similar anomaly in actual temperatures and reported ones. Some of the weather stations, which were once in the countryside, are now in urban areas, and one was proved to have closed down, and others were actually set in concrete, getting energy, getting the heat coming up through the concrete, which was changing the data. I mean, this is so sloppy, it's quite unbelievable. But people out there will repeat it back to you as though these actual figures and these estimations and actually, in most cases, projections are the truth, that they're factual. It's a bit like the 97% of scientists agree. Now, basically, the executive summary on the IPCC date sets, as far as can be ascertained, that this is the first audit, right, of it's called the HADCRUT 4 data set, which is the main temperature data set used in climate assessment reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, governments and the United Nations Framework for the Convention on Climate Change. Now, these are the big daddies that are pushing it. It says that more than 70 issues were actually brought up in this audit of their data set, the HADCRUT data, which is what they rely on. Yeah, more than 70 issues are identified, covering the entire process from the measurements of temperatures to the data set's creation, to data derived from it, such as averages, and its eventual publication. The findings, shown in consolidated form, Appendix 6, it says here, even include simple issues of obviously erroneous data, glossed over sparsity of data, significant but questionable assumptions, and temperature data that has been incorrectly adjusted in a way that exaggerates warming. Again, ClimateGate, all of this stuff, the fraud that's coming out of this is unbelievable. Yet people who believe it will tell you that there are peer-reviewed papers that prove that CO2 drives temperature when there aren't. And they'll never be able to prove it with the data because the data isn't there. It says here, it finds, for example, an observation station reporting average monthly temperatures above 80 degrees C. 2 instances of a station in the Caribbean reporting December average temperatures of 0 degrees C. And a Romanian station reporting at September average temperature of minus 45 degrees C, when the typical average in that month is 10 degrees C. On top of that, some ships that measured sea temperatures reported their locations as more than 80 kilometres inland. Now, this is absolutely negligent and fraudulent at the same time. It carries on. It appears that the suppliers of the land and sea temperature data fail to check for basic errors, and the people who create the Hadkrut data set didn't find them and raise questions either. Well, this is the thing, that nobody in these organisations actually questions this data. It's not analysed enough. The processing that creates the data set does remove some errors, it says here, but it uses a threshold set from 2 values calculated from part of the data, but errors weren't removed from that part before the 2 values were calculated. This is quite incredible. The data set starts in 1850, but for just over 2 years at the start of the record, the only land-based data for the entire southern hemisphere came from a single observation station in Indonesia. At the end of 5 years, just 3 stations reported data in that hemisphere. Global averages are calculated from the averages for each of the 2 hemispheres, so these few stations have a large influence on what's supposedly global. So, isn't this incredible? When you strip this down, it's really shocking. There's nothing there. This is not only sparsity of data, it's actually incredible that this would be allowed to happen. But as we know, there's an agenda behind it, so it's allowed to happen. But it says related to the amount of data is the percentage of the world or hemisphere that the data covers. According to the method of calculating coverage for the data set, 50% global coverage wasn't reached until 1906, and 50% of the southern hemisphere wasn't reached until about 1950. Now, this is really important because when they say since records began, we're really talking about 1950s. So how can people say that since records began, global temperatures have risen and it's this and it's that? You can't really even tell with such a short amount of time when you're looking at the complex weather systems of a planet that's been in existence for billions of years. It's totally crazy. And of course, writing out the medieval warm period doesn't help either. The Maunder minimum, that's another thing that seems to be left out. But it says in May 1861, global coverage was a mere 12%. Well, that's less than 1/8. That's incredible, isn't it? In much of the 1860s and 70s, most of the supposedly global coverage was from Europe and its trade sea routes and ports, covering only about 13% of the Earth's surface. So really, yeah, when they say since records began, they're really talking about the 1950s. It's absolutely incredible, isn't it? Now, one implication of the audit, it says here, is that climate models have been tuned to match incorrect data, which would render incorrect their predictions of future temperatures and estimates of the human influence of temperatures. Now, that's the most important thing. So if this is the data that they're actually using, it's not only fundamentally flawed in certain respects, it's wrong in most respects, and it relies on data that cannot be backed up with any solidity. So, in other words, the whole of the global warming agenda is completely captured, and it is about to be enforced globally through the UN IPCC, the Agenda 2030, the new agenda for the 21st century is the Agenda 2030, which is coming in locally. all of these draconian measures to reduce your carbon footprint and take away your vehicles is coming from this assumption made on behalf of globalist bankers and billionaires, and of course the lobbyists and useful idiots who are employed within the climate change industry. Now, I'm going to sign off, and I'm going to be back in about 10 minutes with Piers Corbyn. But do remember to go to windowsontheworld.net, look at the archive, and look at our shows on sea levels, because this is a huge manipulation that's going on with sea level data. And of course, there's so much in there we've done over the years. Look at our show, Banned Climate Conference Goes Ahead. That's another really good one to be looking at, because those scientists, many of those actually worked for the UN IPCC, and they contributed papers to them. So when people say, where's the peer-reviewed papers? Well, we know that the people who contributed to the IPCC and now have retired or have completely disagreed with the premise of what the IPCC are doing are indeed still there, and their papers are peer-reviewed, and these are respected scientists. So the ad hominems and the childish mantras of the people who are falling for the Extinction Rebellion and the basically climate activist movement really do need to look at some data, but they can't, because they respond to emotion and belief over fact. I'm going to sign off now. I'm going to be back for the second part of the show with Piers Corbyn. Do remember our talks in Oxford on Sunday the 12th of May. Register your interest at windowsontheworld.net. Go to the Eventbrite page, click on it there, and you can get tickets. They're only £10. So, hope to see you in Oxford, and definitely see you in 10 minutes.